So welcome, bienvenue. So this afternoon's first webinar presentation is on responding to domestic violence in the workplace. It's your business. So I'm going to take a few moments to introduce Silke and Jennie before I pass it over to them. My name is Angela Legier and I'm your host for this afternoon. And I'm a member of the Workplace Violence Abuse research team, who's also the team that worked on co-organizing this week's events and learning series. So Silke Brabander is a senior policy and program advisor in violence prevention at the Women's Equality Branch of Executive Council Office with the province of New Brunswick. Silke is fluent in English and French. Silke brings over 15 years of experience in policy analysis, program management, community engagement, and training from working in public, private, and nonprofit sectors. With expertise in gender-based violence, Silke has provided training to thousands of service providers working in the field of domestic violence. Over the last 4 years, Silke has served as a member and chairperson of New Brunswick's Domestic and Intimate Partner Violence in the Workplace Committee, an interagency group representing academia, government, employers, and unions. She has provided training to employers from large HR departments to small businesses on how to address domestic violence in the workplace and why. Originally from Montreal, she holds a BA and an MA in political science with a focus on gender and international relations. So welcome, Silke. Now a little bit about Jennie, who's co-presenting with Silke today. Jennie Wilson and her husband, Peter Tompkins, currently own and operate 11th Mile Restaurant in Fredericton, New Brunswick. Jennie graduated with a Master's in Education, Adaptive Instruction from Ontario Institute of Education in Toronto in 2004. She taught school for a few years, ultimately transitioning into one-on-one clinic work at Angus Lloyd Associates in downtown Toronto. As senior consultant and staff trainer, Jennie oversaw all teaching and training within the clinic. She also provided teacher training and monitoring in public and private school boards across Ontario. Having put herself through her university degrees by working in restaurants, Jennie occasionally worked alongside her chef husband for special events. In 2017, they decided to return to their home province and open a restaurant. The motivation was twofold: to see if they could create and maintain a respectful, positive, and healthy work environment in a sector that employs a vulnerable population, and to contribute to New Brunswick in a meaningful way. The domestic and intimate partner training provided by GNB, Government New Brunswick, represents the type of training that is often offered in more conventional work settings, but is sometimes ignored by segments of the food and beverage industry. Offering these types of trainings contributes to the ultimate goal of creating safer spaces within the industry. An experienced trainer on domestic violence in the workplace and a small business owner who took the training have a conversation about the importance of preparing workplaces on the matter of domestic or intimate partner violence, not the least of which is legislation requiring employers to do so. So Jennie and Silke, over to you, and thanks for being part of the conversation this afternoon.
Well, thank you for that opening, Angela. I'm so glad you put all of that into context, because I had completely forgotten we had submitted some context for you. So thank you for that. Welcome to the show, everybody. And I'm calling it a show because we're more used to sort of giving presentations and formal training and that kind of thing. But this is going to be a little bit more of, as Angela said, a discussion, an armchair discussion between Jennie and me today. Je pourrais prendre des questions en français à la fin de la séance, mais la discussion sera en anglais.
I can take questions in French at the end of the center, but the discussion will be in English.
And in English or French, but this discussion will be in English. And that's a good reminder for me to speak slowly for the interpreters and to pause in between Jenny and me speaking, taking turns back and forth, because I do have a tendency to talk quickly and a lot. So I'll try to pace myself for today's session. So Jenny, I am just going to first start off giving a little bit of the background on what the toolkit is before we get started. So just to present that as background context to everybody, I'm going to bring up the website to show everybody. It is an online toolkit. So here we go. You should be able to see it now, I hope. And if you type in toolkitnb.ca or en français trousnb.ca, there you go, you will get to this page, and this is our online toolkit. So as mentioned, it's not a Government of New Brunswick toolkit, by the way. It is a committee made up of many members from government and non-government, academia and community. So, and we'll recognize those partners at the end. But Women's Equality Branch does participate actively on the committee, so I'm here representing both today. So it is the domestic, or It's Your Business, it's called, a domestic and intimate partner violence workplace toolkit. Once you get in there, so it's free to anybody to use. Anybody with access to the internet can certainly access this, no problem. It's basically, it's been around for about 20 years in one format or another, but we really updated it recently, and we really wanted to make it available to everybody to use in a user-friendly way online. So we've got, the bulk of it is fact sheets on everything you would possibly want to know about related to domestic violence and how it's related to the workplace. You know, for years now, although researchers have been looking into it for at least 30 years now, and we've had some materials are out for a couple of decades now, employers haven't really had to care about it before, or the thinking was, it's none of my business, you know, it's between those two people. In fact, that's what everybody in society has, that's the thinking that has been ingrained in us for years and years and years. But more and more now, there's legislation in place now so that employers have to sort of delve into it a little bit more. And employers, as we've heard all along this week throughout this series of workshops, are making that positive move towards people-centered workplaces and just care more about the overall mental well-being and safety more broadly of their employees, which is really exciting to share, to see. So, so like I said, we have fact sheets, first of all, defining what is domestic or intimate partner violence for employers, why they need to know about it, why employers should care. And by care, we don't just mean, you know, the sort of touchy-feely care. So maybe soft skills aren't your strong suit, and that's fine. But we talk about other concerns of employers with respect to domestic and intimate partner violence, such as the costs to the employer of not addressing it, you know, loss of productivity and that kind of thing, the potential for violence at your workplace, legislation that there is now in terms of 2 different new pieces of legislation, which leads right into the next fact sheet on domestic violence and the law. How to have supportive workplace policies and practices, you know, creating positive work environments, being a good corporate citizen, respecting the confidentiality and privacy of your employees who are in abusive situations. So we have fact sheets on all of these things, everything you could possibly need to know as an employer. What are your rights and responsibilities as an employer and as an employee? We even have one, and this has been a theme throughout this week, I think. A little bit was talked about yesterday, and then tomorrow there's a whole day dedicated to being trauma informed. And so we recognize fully that, you know, businesses have a bottom line. They're not all going to, we're not expecting every employer to become sort of a therapeutic counselor for their employees or anything like that. It's not about that. It's really about bringing back humanity into the workplace. Mm. You know, yesterday we heard at some of the sessions about systemic racism, for example, that we need to take into account the history of the impacts of racism on racialized employees to be able to understand where they're coming from and address their needs appropriately and safely, and to build inclusive inclusive workplace policies. And I would say the same goes for domestic and intimate partner violence. The key message we are trying to make everybody aware of is that, much like systemic discrimination, domestic violence is everyone's business. In other words, to speak bluntly, if you're not addressing it, you're part of the problem, and we all are, by letting it continue to foster under our nose and keep saying it's none of my business and just let it keep happening. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into our discussion, but yeah, domestic and intimate partner violence is a systemic gender-based issue as well. And so we talk about how to take that humanity into account in your workplace. We also talk about respecting the diversity of employees, so not making assumptions that policies will work for everyone. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. And we have a fact sheet on what to do if you have an abusive partner in your workplace, because we automatically tend to think that we're there in situations of domestic violence to help support a victim or a survivor. But in fact, you might have an abusive partner working in your workplace, or both of them working together. So there are things you can do in those cases as well. And we've just recently added one on the red flags and risk factors for domestic violence turning lethal, so potentially really dangerous and happening at your workplace. So what to look out for and what you can do. So those are the basic components of the toolkit in terms of the facts you need to know about. We also have under resources a glossary, an FAQ, a helpful links section where you can have links to other programs like this across Canada, as well as the legislation you need to know about, and support services for your employees or yourself. Anyone can look this up, for where to find help for domestic and intimate partner violence in New Brunswick. We have these videos here which demonstrate just how easy it can be to have those conversations with your employees. So take a look at those if you're interested. And then we have a safety plan template here, which is an individual, it's just a sample that you can print, adapt, use parts of, whatever, or use as a checklist. But it's really meant to be on a case-by-case basis, used for each individual employee who may be in a situation of domestic violence, and what safety measures you can take at your workplace with them. And it's to be done with the victimized partner, not for them or to them. We also have a social media campaign. So we have a Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn account. LinkedIn is not linked to this website just now, but here's our LinkedIn page. They all have the same username, and it's at Toolkit NB. And they're all bilingual. So we share weekly awareness raising tips on what you need to know on a bi-weekly basis. And finally, we offer training. So I will stop sharing here, and this is the perfect segue into our conversation with Jennie today. So one thing we've offered over the years as part of this committee's mandate has been training, and it's been mostly in-person training, of course. And that obviously had to be adapted during COVID. So since then, we have worked on converting it online recently. So now you can request virtual training. It's still live training, but it's virtual. We're also working on developing e-learning modules with WorkSafe New Brunswick. So stay tuned for that. But for now, we still managed to deliver some in-person training over the last few years. And my colleague Lindsay Manuel and I were invited to provide in-person training to the staff of the renowned 11th Mile in Fredericton last year. So Jennie, I'm really happy to have you here, and I'm sure all the employers in the audience are happy to have you here too, and talk about, how your small business benefited from it, and just basically your overall sense of how an employer can benefit from this training and why it's important for employers. So with that, Jennie and I have developed a series of sort of questions to guide us through our conversation, just to keep us on track. So I'll start with my first question, Jennie. What was your motivation in terms of seeking training from us on this specific issue, on intimate partner violence? Why was that an issue that you, as a small family-owned business, thought to address as an employer?
I'm glad you're starting with this question, because I think probably a lot of small business owners are starting here. And much like us, I just want to be frank and say it can be scary sometimes to start to address these kind of what we might term HR issues, or taking care of people issues within the workplace. Like you said, Silke, where's the line between being a small business person and being a therapist? What's my business and what's not my business? am I going to bite off more than I can chew, or get into social spaces where I'm setting myself up to just be criticized? And I think we see that happening a lot, social media and so on. So sometimes I think we can be reluctant to even wade into the water. It seems a bit scary. For us, I mean, we know that you talked a little bit when I was introduced about the fact that I ran a teaching clinic for 18 to 20 years in Toronto. And so one of the things my husband and I had talked about a lot is this sort of disconnect between, let's call it office work, and hospitality lifestyle, and the pieces that sometimes are missing in small businesses, what we would expect in a larger place of business. We know, and I believe you folks have identified this, Silke. I think we talked about it in our training, that the restaurant and bar industry in particular can be a vulnerable space. Oftentimes we have non-existent human resources departments. That's not a thing that exists. And the way in which we can get help for HR problems is unclear. So you start to think like, okay, my only option is to hire a lawyer. And all the fees associated, et cetera. And employee manuals sometimes don't even exist. We see lots of folks starting up small businesses who you have so much to think about, from light bulb to insurance, that anything that you don't have to think about can kind of get pushed away. And for us, we were concerned about creating a workplace that was free from harassment and violence to the best of our ability. So lots of times in hospitality industry, where you're doing a lot of front-facing emotional labor, you're not supposed to have too many feelings, and you're certainly not supposed to have a lot of negative feelings. People want to see you smiling, ready to serve, showing up emotionally all the time, and we know that that can take a toll. And so we are mindful of the mental challenges that come into place in our kind of workplace. We know about fair wages, time off. Those kinds of things are kind of front and foremost. They're easy to see. But as a woman running a small business, and just being totally frank with you, I feel it's a bit of my responsibility to talk about people and putting people first within our workplaces, because I think, and I know this is a heavy kind of gender-based comment, but I think when we have mixed gender workspaces, that's one of the benefits, that we can start to think like, wait a minute, people have feelings. And especially in a kitchen where the expectation, it's been male dominated for a long, long time. And the expectation has been that you work no matter what. You work however many hours you need to work. It doesn't matter if you're sick. It doesn't matter if your kid's sick. You sacrifice everything to be a chef or to be a cook. So that's kind of the backdrop for us. That's a long answer, I know, to your question. But I just felt responsible, and I still do. And it's not about being perfect, but it's about how many pieces of the puzzle can I incorporate that will just help us all be better. And so that was one of the reasons. It wasn't specifically that I felt I needed domestic and intimate partner violence, but that fills in a bigger picture of training that I would like to talk about. And I would even like our staff just to think about restaurants as a place where this kind of training can happen and should happen.
That's excellent. And actually you raised my awareness about that too, that I thought, oh, how great that, it never occurred to me that a small restaurant would request our training. It seems more natural for an HR department or a big corporation who's got, a training component built into their workplace, to request this type of training. But you're right. So you're already setting records. I think you're already setting a good example in terms of, everyone can build violent-free and harassment-free and inclusive workplaces by getting this type of training. And I'm glad that you sought us out, because more and more employers are recognizing the need now for safe workplaces. I think particularly since COVID, mental well-being has become top of mind for a lot of employers, realizing that, employees are not machines. They do burn out. They do have lives that affect their workplace behaviors too, just like employers do. So yeah, it's great to see that small employers like you are able to engage with this type of training and topic and incorporate these types of measures into your business as well. I will say though that even for large businesses and corporations and departments with HR staff, et cetera, this is still a fairly new issue to most workplaces today. Because of legislation that's come into place in the last few years, it's, employers are becoming more aware of it. They might have policies or online modules or things like that, but it's not necessarily still top of mind for everyone. So good on you for being a leader of the pack. And yeah, it's just nice that I think you and I were talking about how, how much time we spend at work and kitchen staff, like you were saying, and front facing staff having to always put on a happy face. And, most of us in the paid labor force spend more of our time, or at least as much time at work as we do at home. So it's nice to have at least one of those primary spaces that we spend most of our time in be safe. If home isn't safe, it's nice to know that at least your workplace is a safe place, right? So
yeah, and that is something I think, because of my history as a teacher, I think about a lot, and much the way that school can be a safety net, can be a safer space for children. I think we have to think of our workplaces in the same way, that we might be serving as a safety net for someone, and we don't realize it. We're a place where you spend a lot of time. And as an adult, whoever's running that workplace is kind of responsible for the vibe that's created. And so I hope that in the same way school can often provide a safer space for kids, we see our workplaces as places where people can access emotional support, can expect to be kept safe to the best of our ability.
exactly. Like you said earlier, without having to become their therapist, but still be able to provide them with whatever safety you can to the best of your ability. Yeah. So what was the process for getting engaged? How did this all happen for you?
Well, as we talked about, it's, I used to hear, whether you watch Dragon's Den or you hear how it is running a small business and you have to wear every hat, but I never really grasped what that meant. Even as sort of that senior consultant within a company, I wasn't the person in charge of the whole thing. So knowing that everything from payroll to, special promotions, all of that is on your plate. Even sourcing the help can be difficult. So you may feel like you'd like to add this piece into your business, but you don't even know where to turn for this kind of help. And of course, you're thinking, what's the price tag going to be? How much is this training going to cost me? Not that you don't care about it and prioritize it, but as I say, when life's moving really fast and you're feeling overwhelmed, it can be hard. I spoke to my good friend Barry McKnight, who I think you have a work history with and a personal history with as well. And he works with the White Ribbon Society. And so this is a topic I talk to Barry about a lot, and has come up in our social conversations. And he put me in touch with you and made me aware of this training. And it seemed like a no-brainer to me. And I was blown away that you folks would come in and spend the whole day with us and go over all this information, and that all of these resources are available at my fingertips. I did not know they were there. And so this is one of the reasons why I agree to participate in conversations of this nature, because I feel like if my peers understood that this information was available to them free, and you've been an ongoing resource to me as well. So I know I can turn to you with questions and so on. So that's how the whole thing started for us.
Excellent. And yeah, it's just for everyone else's benefit, it is free training. Although if you need us to go somewhere else in New Brunswick, we might ask for the cost of travel to be recovered. But other than that, it's free training. We can do it virtually now. We've turned it into half a day, so it's not such a laborious, one full day of training online, especially, which can be a lot longer to sit through. So that's great to hear. Thank you.
Yeah. So then we got to work, and you folks came right in to do a full day training with us. And obviously there's some cost incurred there. You got to pay your staff if you're having them come in and do a full day training. But I mean, that's, to me, that's fully reasonable. And we keep dancing around this issue. I had done some work with a program out of Harvard at OISE, and it was around negotiating difficult conversations and having tough talks with people. And the first class there, we talked a lot about being goal-oriented versus being people-oriented. And that's often we see these things are in opposition to one another. And I think certainly when you're entrepreneurial in spirit, or when you're running a small business, You can become so goal oriented that you forget if you do not have a team, you are not going anywhere. So we see a lot, especially now, so many of us are mired down in staffing issues. We cannot get the people that we need to pull in the same direction. And we see with no team, there's nothing. So taking care of your team, you know, we don't want that to seem like a secondary or a tertiary goal. The team really is the thing, right? And that's what makes it all so great. So we sat down with you, and everybody came. They all wanted to join, and my staff are between 20 and 30 years old. Over the course of the day, the conversations that we had are pretty eye-opening in terms of what we don't always know what people's pasts are and what they've already been through, you know. So I ended up feeling it was such a good thing to do that way. And we were just educated together through the day, you know, given the language to talk about things, given different lenses to think and talk about violence, not just physical violence, other ways that abuse can occur, what it looks like, other things like having us think about the washroom and trips to the washroom as a way sometimes for a person to be alone and to maybe the only time they're going to be apart from a person who may be enacting violence upon them. And being cautious, you know, we're all cautious watching for that now. Folks going to the washroom, and are they taking a really long time and kind of hanging around to talk to us? We have numbers posted there of abuse hotlines and so on. And honestly, Silke, the number of people who comment on that, it rings a bell with me where I'm like, okay, you're noticing that for a reason. Something in your personal life or in your history has kind of caused you to sit up and take notice of that. And then it went a bit beyond that, because of course we're also thinking about the safety of our staff, not just our guests. So we did some risk assessment. We rewrote some policies within our employee manual and dug in just a few little things. Something as simple as saying, oh, the bartender should have a key so she can go out the front door at the end of service, not out the back door into an alley. She hasn't said anything because she doesn't want to seem like a baby. But when I walked through that with her, and I thought, I don't want to walk out in that alley at 11:30 night, little things like, well, they're not little, but things that could be overlooked. So I found it moved this idea of safety to the front of our minds and kind of gave us permission to talk about it with a shared language. I want our staff to feel empowered to talk to each other and to talk to our customers about things of this nature, and to know that they have some education background behind them, that they are, as I say, empowered to ask a question or to use certain language that I think we might have been a bit more reluctant to use.
So I want to come back to that point, but first I just want to point out a couple of things you said that were really helpful, I think, for, again, demonstrating just how easy it can be with taking, they are kind of little measures. They are just small measures, but have a big impact, right? Like making an extra key for someone at the end of the night so they can leave out the front door instead of the back door. That doesn't cost a lot for an employer, and that has a huge impact for an employee feeling safe, right? So again, it's not talking about you as an employer have to solve the problem of domestic violence. It's just saying, can you take small measures and eventually maybe bigger measures too? But you talked about keys, you talked about I think you talked about lighting in your back alley as well too. Mm-hmm. You talked about printing off those support services numbers and posting them in your bathroom, which was helpful in your case, like you said, not just to staff, but also to all your customers. So if you are an employer who has a customer facing business, then those measures that you take for your employees can also be helpful to the public. So yeah, any member of the public can go into the bathroom and say, oh, wow, I didn't know all these free resources existed for domestic and intimate partner violence. And there's the list of phone numbers right there in front of you. So that's really, really helpful. And I think that's something that's anybody can take any measure, anybody can take that measure. And by the way, for the audience members, that list of support services can be found under the helpful links in on our webpage too. So it's not something special that Jennie had to request access to or anything. It's available to everyone out there. So that's really great to hear, but you also talked about, you know, the discussions with staff changing and sort of giving them the language to empower all of you to talk more about this issue. And I think I'd like to hear a little bit more about your experience with that and how training helped a little bit with that. Because like you said, I think knowledge is power, right? So I guess it's just having more information gives you more power to be able to talk about it. But yeah, do you have anything you can share on that front?
I think we're all evolving, and you know, I think I'm 46 now. I might be 47. And we all lost a year or two in COVID. But anyway, I was brought up in an industry, a hospitality industry, that was very strict around the customer is always right. And our job is to be as unobtrusive as possible and to make sure that customer is made to feel happy. We are in a tipped industry, which adds another strange layer sometimes to what you may or may not say to a customer. And we are interested in shifting that narrative. Although we remain a tipped industry, I think that we need to take a little bit more power and a little bit more responsibility for what goes on right under our nose in the restaurant. And it's not just okay, you cannot behave however you like. We see that in many different layers, but in particular here, you know, in terms of the customer is always right. Well, what do you do when you suspect the customer is doing harm? Similarly, where does the privacy concern between me and my staff, where does that end if I suspect they're being harmed? So what's the right way to intervene? And I guess where do those lines lie? What are the rules? And so you gave us permission and direction even to question, to be able to say to a customer, is everything going okay here? Just that simple question of intervening and asking, you know, my eyebrows are up to here, you know what I'm asking. I would probably not have done that before this training. I think, again, like you tend to say, this sort of feeling of it's, oh, that's between the two of them. I don't know what's going on there. Don't meddle. Don't get involved in someone else's business. That kind of thinking would have probably taken over within the moment. Or to say to a coworker, you know, is everything okay? This kind of sounds like the kind of thing Silke was talking about. Like, do you feel that way? And checking in. And I think you've raised something already, and I'm going to loop back to it a couple times with this idea that then it doesn't mean it's your responsibility as the employer to solve. It's making people aware that you're aware, that you care, and that you're here to support. And I think that is an important distinction for many of us to understand, because it's not that you're then taking the weight totally on you and you have to, you know, fix it all. So I think we're empowered about intervening and asking questions when we see something we don't like. And it's pretty clear to everyone. You'll see all three employees in the front of the house looking at each other like, you see this? You know what I mean? And it's time for someone to go over and say something. And then that second aspect of feeling empowered, I think, is in naming abuse. So when you're able to say, that sounds like a form of financial abuse, just that language is so powerful. And I think we may have shied away from those conversations in the past because no one wants to be the alarmist. No one wants to be an accuser. No, do you know what I mean? And you get so scared around all these legal issues. But when you know that you have the definition of certain words and you can use them with confidence, I think we all feel more able to have these talks. So you helped us create a shared language that would allow us to discuss these issues between ourselves and then with our customers. So it can be tricky to approach, but it feels a lot less tricky now.
Well, that's great to hear. And I will say it was Lindsay and me who both gave you that language. Lindsay's a big part of getting people to name that abuse and all that stuff. Yeah. And I think that's just it. It's having all those terms too. Like, not everybody realizes that domestic violence isn't just physical violence. So we spent probably a long portion of your day on teaching about the different forms of domestic or intimate partner violence. And a lot of that is coercive control of one partner over another, which includes financial control or exploitation or abuse. verbal abuse, and so on and so on. So yeah, I think that's great that you're able to recognize those things now, and you know, you don't have to necessarily say that to a customer, but certainly having the power or the comfort level, I guess, to intervene and say, hey, is everything okay here? That's all it takes. Sometimes that'll stop somebody in their tracks, and they'll realize, oh, I'm being called out here, and that could be enough, you know, so, or offering support beyond that. But yeah, not about taking it on as your problem to solve or anything like that, but still having a role to play.
Mm.
So any other examples you can think of, you know, where this has impacted staff or?
Sure. I mean, you know, I can give you a few. We're still, of course, very friendly with our restaurant friends in Toronto. And Peter spent 20 years there working with a family of restaurants. So you can imagine they serve as mentors to us, and we share information back and forth. And in fact, I've shared these resources with them because it's very challenging, as I say, as a small business person, to kind of access and find some of this stuff. So for instance, they had an incident where a manager began a romantic relationship with a server, which should not be happening. And so that was kept private from everyone at work, almost. And then that manager accused that server of abuse. So this is a very layered, I mean, this is our worst nightmare. As a small business person, I was just like, oh. And so many small business owners, I think, your gut instinct would be the first thing, the right thing to do is you fire that abuser, right? And I'm sure many of us remember an incident that happened here in Fredericton just a couple of years ago that touched on this note in the industry around someone being accused, and there being a sort of a general swell of public idea that accused should be fired immediately. And I think that's a reasonable kind of gut response or reaction. But because of the time we had spent with you and Lindsay, you opened our eyes to another aspect of this, the importance of following a due process and respecting the rights of everyone involved. And we were able to pass on to them our process for reviewing complaints, meeting individual needs, beginning with inquiry, moving through assessing safety for everyone involved, and what actions could you take? Could these people be separated in their shifts? Could this person who's been accused not be set up to have this experience again while we're investigating? You know, just avoiding that kind of knee-jerk, like fearful reaction, and coming at this more as I don't want to say an investigation, but that's kind of what it is, that there's a process that has to be followed. And it doesn't matter where I'm getting emotion from. I don't need to respond emotionally.
Yeah.
There's a process I can follow. So like that alone was very, I mean, that's huge for me and super helpful. So that would be one experience that we had. I remember in particular, we had a couple in the restaurant who the number of drinks they'd had did not match the level of intoxication they were just like demonstrating, which suggests like, okay, we missed something. These folks came in intoxicated, which sometimes you don't catch. You give them one more drink and then you think, oh my gosh. And he was raising his voice at her in a way that, as I say, every server in the restaurant, you know, and I just went over and said, is everything okay here? It sounds like things are getting heated. And he was mortified. And of course, we know if someone's behaving that way in private, I'm concerned, or in public, I'm concerned about how you're behaving in private, but I can't solve the whole thing. But I can let you know right now in this moment, I don't have to say your behavior is inappropriate. You just felt it from me, or I wouldn't. I'm not going around asking everyone if everything's okay in that way.
Yeah.
So something like that, where I would have probably thought I should mind my business. And, you know, we had another incident that kind of circles around this where it was two couples and the guys were into it, having cocktails, having drinks, and so on. And one of the women was driving for all four. And she began to demonstrate signs of discomfort when he was ordering drinks. I might have previously just assumed you're being kind of a killjoy. He just wants to have, do you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
I caught her on the way to the washroom, and I just said, are you concerned? And she said, yeah. And I thought to myself, I don't know why that person is concerned. This could be an at-home abusive situation, when all this liquor is added. And I just, well, what would you like me to do? And she said, just don't put any more alcohol in those drinks. And I said, fine. So he didn't know, she paid the bill. It was all mocktails and the price was appropriate. And we just stopped serving him alcohol.
Wow.
Again, that kind of intervention, I think I would have been very reluctant.
Yeah.
But I'm just thinking through a slightly different lens,
Great. That's so creative too, for you to find these different ways of, you remind me actually of what PEI had done an awareness campaign a few years back about the restaurant industry, precisely dealing with this issue and sort of pouring extra water in the woman who was the victimized partner in this scenario, in her drinks all night, in her glass all night, to get her to go to the bathroom so that she could have that private conversation with her, for example. So just being creative like that it sounds like you're already doing that. So it's fantastic that you have that comfort level now, and I'm glad to hear that. And I'm also glad that the discussion we had in training about, not having a gut reaction of just firing somebody whom you hear is abusive right off the bat. That's not necessarily the best solution. Just for everyone here's benefit, that could actually be a risk factor to escalate the violence. That person, if you fire them, they might take it out on their partner. Even if it's their ex-partner, they still might take it out on them, thinking that it's their fault they lost their job. And unemployment, generally speaking, is a risk factor for domestic violence turning lethal. So yeah, it's really important to have that due process like you talked about, and to really have an inquiry at least, or whatever methods you can as an employer to sort of look into it more, offer help to both parties if they both work for you, what supports you might be able to help them both find. So it could be really preventing a workplace tragedy, because domestic violence is actually the #1 instigator or trigger of any type of violence in the workplace. So it happens here in New Brunswick, and you're preventing it every day by intervening in those situations. So good on you, Jennie. And so, yeah, just trying to think. We talked a lot about your empowerment, your comfort level now. That's excellent. Working together with your staff. I think you told me that you work with your staff on doing the risk assessment and sort of informing your policies now in the workplace. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, or your discussions with staff?
Yeah, I mean, it was just very interesting that they were able to pinpoint to me exactly where they wanted a little more support. I would just say, and it's funny because, again, young women and even older women, we joke about times we feel unsafe, and that you're being a wuss or whatever, or that you're must be something wrong with me to be afraid, to go down in the basement alone, or we all walk with our keys stuck between our fingers, and all these things we do that you joke with each other about. But I said, can you just tell me about those things you're doing at work? Because maybe you don't need to do it. And maybe you're not silly or stupid for doing it. It's there for a reason, the fear, right? That's your instinct. That's your gut telling you this doesn't seem quite safe. And so little things like, when I've got my lead server and my bartender, who are both women under the age of 30, and the kitchen staff have gone home, let's lock up those doors so that you're not back turned doing something and someone walks in the door and you don't realize it.
Yeah.
You can go ahead and set the alarm that you're still in the building, but if anybody enters the building, that alarm's going to go off, which is going to scare people. We've talked about processes for when folks enter the building who shouldn't be there. And this happens from time to time. Who's the point person, to go and handle that individual? And sometimes it's different point people for different individuals, because we're like, okay, this one is argumentative and responds better to a male. So we need, you know what I mean? So
yeah.
Just to deal with sort of some of the folks who may come in and out of our restaurant who aren't our customers, and that happens. You need to use the washroom or whatever.
Yeah.
So we talked about a lot of those things. And then we did talk on a personal level too about their own feeling safety at home. And I, was able just to say to them, it's important that we have a line, that I am your employer. I am not your best friend. I'm not your mother, and I'm not your therapist. But if you need help, I'm going to help you get help from the right person. And just that kind of gentle assistance where it's like, okay, you're having a problem. Okay, I'm not the one, but we're going to call this person. We're going to set you up. Do you know what I mean?
Exactly, exactly. And that's just it. You're being a respectful, humane employer. That's the basic gist of it, right? Like it's.
Yeah, because sometimes in restaurants, you may see, and I know other businesses do this too, this family metaphor, and we push hard against that. We are not a family. We are a team. I'm your coach. I'm not your mom, and you're not my kid. So, you don't usually you don't quit families, right? You don't switch families, you don't usually. So this metaphor can be so harmful within a restaurant workspace or any workspace where it's like, no, we're a team. Play your time on the team. If you want to trade teams, you're allowed. If you're injured, sick, you're benched for some reason, we're going to support you until you can get back in the game, and we talk about things in that way, which I find to be super useful.
Nice. That's fantastic. Gosh, you're making it seem really easy, I think, for everybody here today who's an employer, to show just how easy it is to address. No, but really to address it. Solving it. No. I know that we have to save some time for Q&A, but I wanted to just mention quickly, because you had mentioned this to me on the side, you had also talked about, not giving out staff information if somebody comes in looking for them, not necessarily giving their whereabouts or seeing whether they're on shift today or not too. That was another small measure that I think is such an important one, to respect the privacy of your employees and not just give out information.
Especially small town living,
Yeah.
Fredericton's not huge, small city, big town, however you look at it.
Yeah.
And sometimes we can lapse into thinking everybody knows everybody, where's the harm?
Exactly.
And as a restaurateur, we certainly don't we don't use identifying information of people in the restaurant when we are doing our social media. And that's something that's very important. Don't take people's pictures and post it without asking. You don't know why they might not want everyone to know where they are.
Exactly.
And then same with employees. If someone is that close to my bartender, they should know her number and where she is. They shouldn't have to come through me. Yeah. So just always being cautious, even passing on phone numbers, that kind of thing. If someone, this just happened last week where I had customers who want to take one of the staff members to dinner to celebrate something. And they were coming through me to do that arrangement. I think they didn't want to make it too personal, which I appreciated. It would have been much easier for me to just give the bartender's number to those people. But I was like, oh, you don't just give it. So, asking permission, asking everybody, share contact information. We don't put people in touch without that kind of
consent.
And
yeah, great. So did you have any questions for me, or do you want to? Okay.
One thing that you and I have talked about a little bit, that, I think this might be something that can make some of us uneasy if we're not part of either of these groups. That, again, this idea of where I said I don't want to be cocky, like I never want to set myself up as like I have all the answers and we're doing it perfectly, because we're not. And one of the things you and I have talked about is intimate partner violence and how it affects different groups in different ways. For example, folks within BIPOC or LGBTQIA plus community may come up against additional barriers in this realm. And when we talked the other day, I said, Silke, we're all white women. Like, what? Oh, how do we open up that conversation and start to understand some of those other barriers a little bit better?
Yeah, that's a really great point, and I'm so glad you raised it. Yesterday's sessions actually had some Indigenous folks, and we had the Commissioner on Systemic Racism speaking. So it actually ties in very nicely to this. Because yeah, you're right, as researchers and policy analysts and people who work in this field of domestic violence, we talk about how it's rooted in patriarchal gender imbalances, and the statistics show that it's 80% of survivors or victims are women, and over 90% of perpetrators are men. So we tend to talk about it in this he-she dichotomy. But you're right, especially when you're talking about that. So, sorry, let me back up for a second. So that's really just looking at it from the gender binary, right? From the heteronormative terms. So if you're only taking into consideration heterosexual couples, yes, it's 90% of perpetrators tend to be men and 80% of victims tend to be women. But when we consider transgender people and genderqueer couples and gay and lesbian and two-spirit couples or people in relationships, there's an even greater risk of them being subjected to this type of violence, as well as, like you said, facing those other barriers. So they might be afraid of facing racism on top of coming out about their situation of domestic violence. So they might not come to you if you're not a super approachable person, or if you don't have an anti-racism policy too, or sort of incorporate that into your policies and practices, leading by example. They might be afraid to be outed if they come forward, if they're in an abusive same-sex relationship. They might not have the same services that will be as friendly or accessible to them. So we talked yesterday, they talked a little bit about, culturally safe and appropriate EFAP services, for example. And then, there's also people with disabilities. There's, our service is accessible to everyone with visible and invisible disabilities. We talk about, Indigenous, Black and other racialized, marginalized groups facing other barriers in terms of, so we talked a little bit earlier about, taking the whole history of all of that into account, and not just responding to one incident of, okay, this employee came forward to me with a situation of domestic abuse. There's a whole lot of other stuff there that needs to be demonstrated that you understand that they're going through. And then there's, so there's distrust of services potentially. So just saying, oh, call 911 might not work for everybody. If you're Black or Indigenous or a newcomer or a refugee, calling 911 might not be the first thing that they're going to agree to do or want to do. Newcomers might have other barriers like language barriers, or if they are a refugee or a sponsored immigrant, they might have fear, and it might be a legitimate fear, that their abuser could have them deported. So all kinds of different intersections and barriers that people might face. And it's not just a white women and white men situation. There's a whole lot of other factors that intersect with domestic and intimate partner violence. Although it can affect anyone equally, or not equally, like I said earlier, I think Indigenous women are at least twice as likely to experience this type of violence. People with disabilities are 4 times as likely to experience this type of violence, because it could include their caregiver on whom they depend for access to things could be abusing them. So all of which to say, yeah, I think someone mentioned this yesterday too. If you think all your staff look alike, think again. Because one person mentioned yesterday that an Indigenous person had never come out as being an Indigenous, so this employer thought all their staff was white, for example. And don't just assume that any policies you design that work for you, don't assume they would work for all your staff also, because they're not like you. They could be totally different from you. They could be from a marginalized group, be it gender or sexual orientation or race or anything. So, or invisible disabilities again. So yeah, I think the key is to work with all your staff like you've been doing, get feedback from them on what works for them, and you might have some aha moments where you realize, oh, okay, I thought this would work for everybody, but that's just because it works for me. So yeah, I think that's just really important, is to have policies, but to make them flexible and to also address situations on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah.
So I see we only have 5 minutes left. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, actually, we're down to about a minute. So I don't think we're going to really have time for Q&A because our next presenter is in the wings. Silke and Jennie, I really want to thank you on behalf of the Workplace Violence and Abuse Research Team for having this really frank discussion. And what a model for a small business owner, Jennie, you and your spouse, to bring this training to your team. And it's really eye-opening to recognize how accessible it is. And thank you for walking us through the toolkit. And so that everyone who may have questions as they move on to the next presentation know where they can find you, Silke. And I know you referenced Lindsay as well, who co-facilitates with you, who we know well from the WVAT team. And Jennie, we know where to find you at the 11th mile as well. So thank you for your kind offering through the conversation today.
Thanks so much for having me. Thank you, Silke.
Yes,
Thank you, Lindsay.
thank you, Jennie. And yes, please feel free to pass on our contact information if anybody has any questions. Happy to share. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great afternoon.